Hello and welcome to Lecture 4 on the Classical Era. Today I'm going to talk about what to expect in the third movement of a four-movement work and in the last movement of any multi-movement instrumental work of the Classical Era, whether it has three movements or four movements. So let's review where we were last time. In Lecture 3 I talked about what to expect in the first and second movement of a multi-movement work. And to recap, the first movement of a multi-movement instrumental work of the Classical Era, such as a symphony, a string quartet, a sonata for a solo instrument, or even a concerto, is going to be in some kind of sonata form, where we have three main sections. It's exposition, development, and recapitulation, right? And there are two different main themes, and there are these connecting passages, which we call a bridge, and there might be a closing theme. There's different things going on in each of those sections, but in sonata form, we have three main sections: exposition, development, recapitulation, and the tempo is going to be fast. It's usually going to be marked allegro. And this is why we sometimes see sonata form, this type of form, referred to as sonata allegro form, or sometimes even first movement sonata form. And remember, in this case, the use of the word sonata is describing this particular type of form, whether or not the title of the piece is sonata or something else like symphony or string quartet. Second movements of multi-movement works, it's harder to generalize. There's about the only generalization we can make about them is that they will be slow in tempo in order to contrast with the fast tempo of the first movement, and they will be in some other form besides sonata form, again to contrast with the first movement. Which other form that may be, it's up to the composer. We listened to an example of a second movement of a Haydn symphony last time, and that had a second movement which was in theme and variation form. But really any form is possible here as long as it's not sonata form. So we could see rondo form, or maybe some kind of a binary form. Or, there are a lot of possibilities, but it won't be sonata form because, again, the idea is to have some variety as we go from the first movement to the second movement. So first movements will be fast and in sonata form. Second movements will be slow and in some other form. So now we get to talking about third movements and finales. Now, I have to once again clarify, I know this is potentially confusing. Generally speaking, multi-movement works of the Classical Era are either four movements or they are three movements. But notice the movement that I'm leaving out isn't the one on the end. It's the third one out of four, right? This third movement, if it is not present, then we have a three-movement work, and what we have is fast and sonata form, slow and some other form. Final movement will be fast again and in either rondo form or sonata form, most likely. Right? If we have a third movement, then it will be dance-like. It will be modeled on a specific type of dance called the minuet, which was the most popular dance of the 18th century. It will be dance-like, and it will be in a form we call ternary form. Right? And a four-movement work will always have that dance-like ternary form minuet movement. But a three-movement work usually will not. Right? So that's the one that is omitted. And that's why when I talk about third movements, I'm talking about this movement. If I'm talking about this movement over here, the last movement, whether it is a three-movement work or a four-movement work, I'm talking about the finale, right? So I'm going to cover first third movements of four-movement works, and then I'll talk about finales in this lecture, last movements. Okay, so as I said, the third movement will be dance-like in character. It's modeled on a specific type of dance, the minuet. This is a dance with a sort of a moderate tempo. It's neither particularly slow nor fast. It was the most popular dance of the 18th century, so it was very familiar. The style, the step, and the tempo of the minuet was very familiar to all, let's say, middle class and above people, because dancing was very popular back then. And if you went to a dance, remember, there were certain specific steps. People danced in groups. You needed to know your steps, or you would make a fool of yourself and bump into people, and nobody wants that. So everybody knew these dances pretty well. And there's a certain structure to the minuet. And in fact, you might see it referred to over here on page 173 of the textbook as minuet and trio. What's the trio? It's just the middle section of a minuet. So here's how the thing is structured. The minuet itself, we could say, is letter A. It's the first section, right? And then we have a contrasting middle section. We can call it letter B, like big letter B. And then the composer will indicate in the music to the performers that when they come to the end of this B section, the trio, they are to go back to the beginning and play the minuet one more time and then stop. And that's it, right? So it's minuet, trio, repeat of minuet, A, B, A. And since there are 3 sections, even though 2 of the sections are the same music, it's a 3-section form, so we call it ternary form. I should mention, when we get to Beethoven, right? Now, Beethoven, remember, well, we haven't really talked in detail about him yet, but we will. Beethoven is the latest, the last of our 3 major classical masters. In order, they are Haydn is the oldest, born 1732. Mozart, born 1756, unfortunately dies, the earliest out of all of them, dies in 1791. Beethoven, born in 1770 and lives all the way till 1827. By the time we get into the 19th century, the 1800s, the minuet is kind of going out of favor. It's seen as kind of stodgy and not particularly exciting. So it's no longer the most popular dance of the 19th century. And for this reason, probably, Beethoven and other composers, but especially Beethoven, begin sort of moving away from using the minuet as the model for the dance-like movement of his 4-movement works. And instead, he more often uses the title scherzo. Scherzo is spelled S-C-H-E-R-Z-O. It's a hard C-H in there, so it's pronounced scherzo. And it simply means joke. It's the Italian word for joke. So it's supposed to be sort of a lighter, humorous piece, perhaps. Faster tempo, much faster than the minuet. I think that's the main thing, probably, that Beethoven and others might have found kind of stodgy about the minuet, that it had this moderate tempo, and the scherzo was a sort of a more exciting alternative. So as we move into the 19th century, especially in Beethoven, we might see this scherzo and trio instead of minuet and trio. But it still has that same structure, A, B, A. So now it's scherzo, trio, and repeat of the scherzo. And the main difference is it's faster, it's livelier. Right? But otherwise, again, this ternary form still persists. Also, you will see, if you look on page 174 of the text, there's a sort of a mid-level structure going on as well. So the macro structure is A, B, A. But then something very similar to that macro structure is also found in each section. So in the minuet, there's a little a, and then a contrasting B section, and a return of little a. The little a is repeated, and then the B followed by A, which follows, is also repeated. Okay? So it's something like a duplication of the macro structure on a micro level. It isn't exactly the same because of where the repeats are. If we have 2 sections, one of them is A, and the other one is B followed by A, and these two sections repeat. You might say, well, what's the difference? That looks ternary to me as well. Actually, it's what we call rounded binary, because there's really two sections. Each section repeats, but there's a little bit of A after the lowercase b, right, to round off this two-part form. That's what we call rounded binary. And really the difference between ternary, in order to make it really a ternary form, each of these sections would have to be separate, and if they were repeated, they'd have to be repeated separately. Don't need to get into it that much, but if you, and I will help you, we will listen to an example of this, and you will hear how each of these sections repeats. Notice how when we get to the trio, we have that same structure. It's just that we have to use different letters. We can't call it little a, little b, and return a little a anymore because it's different material. But this different material has the same relationship. It's something different, and then a return of the something. We're going to use letters C, D, and C to indicate that the form is exactly the same. It's just that the material is different. Right? When the minuet returns at the end, right, that's the last part of our ternary three-part form, we don't do those little internal repeats because we've already heard that initial little a and little b and return of little a. We've already heard it repeated the first time through, so we don't do those internal repeats when it returns at the end. I should mention also, remember there's always the possibility of a coda in there. Remember that a coda is a concluding section which we might find on the end of any piece of music from any era, really, even the modern era. If we have a coda in a minuet and trio like this, we're actually going to hear it 3 times. We're going to hear it it's going to be after little a, the return of little a in the minuet. Now, the one that we're going to listen to first does not have a coda. But if you can imagine, if we have a concluding section, it's got to be at the end of the minuet. And we end up hearing the end of the minuet 3 times. We hear the entire minuet repeated at the beginning of the movement. And then we hear the contrasting trio, the B section, that gets repeated. And then we hear the minuet yet again, only once this time. We don't repeat it when it reappears. But if we have a coda, we will hear that coda again at the end. All right. There's always a possibility of a coda being tacked onto any piece of music. It's usually not considered a major structural section. Right? It's not something that necessarily has to be there. It's optional, so we don't usually consider it as part of the structure in a general sense. Right? Okay, so the example that they decided to use to illustrate this form is from a serenade by Mozart. What is a serenade? It's a type of chamber music for a small group, which was normally performed as more or less background music or light entertainment for a social gathering like a party. And Mozart composed many, many of these serenades. Remember, in those days, if you were throwing a party and you wanted music, it had to be live music performed by people. There were no boom boxes or Bluetooth speakers or anything like that. You had to have actual musicians performing there. And Mozart was very often asked to compose music for these kind of occasions. It's the kind of thing he could do very, very quickly. And this particular piece, Eine kleine Nachtmusik, the title simply means a little night music. And this is a 4-movement work, as most chamber music was, like string quartets, serenades, other types of music for a small group. So the 3rd movement is Dancelike. It's a minuet and trio. The 1st movement of this piece, by the way, is probably one of the most familiar works by Mozart. The very first movement of Eine kleine Nachtmusik is this thing. You've heard heard this before, probably. This is actually in sonata form because it's the first movement. And notice it's fast in tempo. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm sure it would probably amaze Mozart that if he could be brought back to the present, brought forward to the present, and it could be told that, oh yes, you are regarded as one of the greatest composers of all time, and of your over 600 major works, this is probably the one that people know best. And if you were to play, I think he would probably be very surprised because it's probably something that he composed very quickly, didn't really give a lot of thought to. It was just music for a party, and certainly not one of his major masterpieces like his operas or his symphonies or what have you. But for whatever reason, maybe just because it's so catchy, that's one of Mozart's best known works. Okay, so we're going to listen to the third movement of this same work, and I will, as I did in the previous lecture, I will have to talk over it a little bit as I point out the form. Also, notice that this movement is fairly short, and typically in a four-movement work, that third dance-like movement is usually the shortest. Right? So these little sections, this little a, little b, little a, they're going to go by pretty quickly. I mean, that little a is really just a single phrase, more or less, a single musical sentence, as is little b, little c, little d. Each one of these little subsections is very short. Of course, they are often repeated, but the whole piece is over with pretty quickly. All right, let's see if we can find it here. Okay, this is little a. Of the minuet. Go back and repeat it. Little a being repeated. Little b. It's something different, right? And then little a comes back. We go back and repeat. Little b. Little a comes back, and now the trio. Very different mood, right? It's more linear, it's more graceful, it's a little bit lighter. So we're listening to little c. We go back and repeat that. And now on to little d. We're still in the trio. And little c comes back. We go back and repeat this section. So little c, little d, followed by little c. And now we're getting to the end of the trio. So the minuet is going to come back. Exact repetition, except we're not going to repeat these little subsections. This is little a. We're just going to hear it once. And then go right on to little letter B. Little a comes back. And that's it. That's the entire movement. Right? Now, I want to play one other example of a minuet and trio by Mozart, and this is from the symphony that we heard in the last lecture. So if you remember that first movement that we heard of the Symphony Number 40, it's a very intense, dramatic symphony in G minor by Mozart. The third movement of that is also a minuet and trio. And what I want to do here is point out how we can have essentially the same form, but a very different mood and character. This third movement is going to be a little bit, it's going to sound bigger because first of all, it's a full orchestra instead of a little chamber ensemble. It's from a bigger, more serious work, a symphony instead of a serenade. And it does have a coda. It has a coda which we'll hear at the end of each iteration of the minuet, the A section. And there's also wonderful variety of orchestration in here that I'm going to point out, which we don't really get in the serenade because that's just a very small string ensemble. So let me find my track number here, and we will listen to the third movement of Mozart's Symphony number 40, which is also minuet and trio, but sort of much more serious somehow. Here we go. So, little A. We repeat little A. Little B. Little A returns. Then we have a coda. Notice how the change of the orchestration in the coda, it just goes to the winds. Now we repeat. This is little B. And little A. Coda. Exactly the same as what we heard before, it's just a literal repetition. And now the trio. Very different character again. It's lighter, it's more graceful. This is little C. Some oboes, a flute, bassoon, violins come back. We repeat all of that. This is little C repeating. Oboes, flute, bassoon, each taking the melody in turn. Violins. This is letter D, little d. And Mozart brings in more instruments like some French horn, French horn again, and this is basically the C material. We go back, letter D, letter C. We're coming to the end of the trio. So that serious, heavy mood that we heard at the beginning is now back. We're in the repeat of the minuet. This is little A. We're not going to repeat little A this time. We're going to go right on. Little B. Return of little a. And the coda. There you go. Okay, so let's move on now and talk about what to expect in the finale, the last movement. One thing that could happen is we could have a last movement in sonata form. The first movement would have been in sonata form, but by the time we get to the final movement, whether there's 3 movements or 4, some composers considered it acceptable to have another movement in sonata form. Of course, the material would be completely different, the themes, etc., but the structure might be the same. However, I would say that it's a little bit more common for the final movement to be in rondo form. Okay. Now, either way, it will be it will have a fast tempo. Composers generally like to have a first movement fast and the last movement also fast, so that we kind of start things off with something that is vigorous and liable to grab your attention, but also end on a more energetic note, right? And the slow movement is going to be in the middle somewhere. Now, rondo form can also be used for the second movement, right, for the slow movement. And so I'm going to point out that rondo form isn't only used for the finale, it could also be used as the form for a slow movement. So just kind of keep that in mind. Also, there are 2 varieties of rondo form, and I think I already mentioned this in my in lecture 2, but no harm going over it again. First of all, keep in mind the basic idea of a rondo, which is that we have a main theme, a main section, we'll call it A. That A material keeps coming back around, like a merry-go-round, okay? That's maybe a good way to think of it since it's rondo form. In between it's coming back around again, we have contrasting material. It's going to be A, B, A, C, A, and we could stop there. If it's a 5-part rondo, it might just be A, B, A, C, A, right? Or we might stick a coda on the end of it. So it might be A, B, A, C, A, coda. Or the final A section itself might also have sort of the character of a coda. It's not necessarily always cut and dried, but there could be like a full repetition of A, or reappearance of A on the end and a coda, right? Or the coda and A could be kind of one and the same at the end, right? But the basic structure of a 5-part rondo is A, B, A, C, A. The other possibility is a 7-part rondo. The only difference is we take that 5-part rondo, A, B, A, C, A, and we bring back B one more time. So that's our 6th section. But having brought back B, we got to bring back A again, because we always want to begin and end with A. So a 7-part rondo is A, B, A, C, A, B, A. And on the end of that, we might, again, have a coda. Or we might sort of integrate the final A and the coda and make them more or less one and the same, right? There might also be little connecting passages, what we might call like a bridge leading from, let's say, B back to A or from C back to A. Those are not considered major sections. They're just like connective tissue that holds the structure together. Also, as we will see in this example that we're going to listen to, since the composer keeps bringing back A, that basic A material every time, it might not be literally identical each time. There might be slight alterations, right? There might be some little embellishment or different instrumentation or whatever. It'll be similar enough that you can recognize the tune as A, Right? The composer wants you to recognize this is the melody you heard at the beginning, you're hearing it again over here, you're hearing it again over here. But he might tweak it slightly so that it isn't literally exactly the same. Another thing about rondo form is that the A sections are always going to be in the original key. So let's say I'm starting out my rondo in the key of C. Each time that A material appears, it'll be in the key of C, and that way I will end in the same key that I started. The B section will be in a contrasting key. The C section will be in a contrasting key yet again. So I might go from the key of C major to the key of G major for my B section, back to the key of C for my return of the A material, and then maybe to, I don't know, the key of F for the key of A minor for my C section, back to the tonic key for my A section. If I decide to do a 7-part rondo and bring back the B material, well, I will probably bring it back in the original key of the piece because I'm getting toward the end now, and I don't want to be straying too far from my original key. Remember, I need to end the movement in the same key that I began it in. All right, what we are going to listen to is a rondo by Beethoven. This is the finale, the last movement of one of his string quartets. Remember, a string quartet is generally a 4-movement work. One other thing I should mention in here, since the book mentions it, there is such a thing as a sonata rondo, sonata-rondo. And this is sort of kind of like a hybrid between sonata form and rondo form, because if you look at, to review let's look at our 7-part rondo. A, B, A, C, A, B, A. There's some parallels here with sonata form. If we think of the A and B as being sort of like the first and second theme, right? Notice how the A first appears in the original key, the B is going to be in some contrasting key. At least, certainly the first time we hear them, but at the end, they both appear in the same key because we're trying to stay in the home key. And that C section in the middle, composers sometimes looked at that C section and said, you know what, I think I want to make a little development section out of this. I'm going to take my themes and break them down and maybe have some increased intensity and maybe some polyphonic texture, the kinds of things that I might do in a development section of a work in sonata form. So basically, if you see a 7-part rondo, this is something usually composers will do with the big rondo, the 7-part rondo. If you see a 7-part rondo where the C section has the characteristics of a development, which is of course the middle section of a sonata form, then we might refer to it as sonata rondo form. And the book describes it exactly that way. The sonata rondo contains a development section like that in sonata form and is outlined A-B-A, development section A-B-A, where the development section is the C section. And notice it's really something that is particular to the long rondo. Okay, and so this example we'll listen to is by Beethoven. This is, by the way, one of Beethoven's earlier works. One of the things we will learn about Beethoven is that his output is generally divided into early, middle, and late. And we see some significant changes from one style period to the next. So this is an early period of work. This is among his earliest published works, written when he was in his late 20s. Right? Notice a couple other things. See how it says here, Beethoven String Quartet in C minor, Opus 18, number 4. What is that? Oh, OP.18. That OP stands for opus, O-P-U-S, and it's just the Latin word for work. Opus 18 means this is Beethoven's 18th published work. Now, there are other unpublished works which Beethoven composed, but this is something we find with most, not all, but most composers, certainly from the classical era onward. Either the composer themselves or their publishers assign these opus numbers to them so that we can see where in the sequence of that composer's works that particular piece lies. So we can know, is it his first work, his second work, his 50th work, right? And in Beethoven's case, these opus numbers run up into the 130s, right? So, something like 136 major works. Now, some of these opus numbers contain multiple pieces, and each piece has multiple movements, and that is the case with these string quartets. The Opus 18, I believe there are 7 string quartets in that opus, and this is number 4 out of the 7, and we're just listening to one movement out of that multi-movement string quartet. So the opus numbers don't necessarily tell you exactly how many pieces there are, but they give you a rough idea. With Mozart, by the way, we don't have opus numbers. Instead, we have these K numbers. K stands for Kerkel. Kerkel was a guy who lived after Mozart's time, who began basically assembling and collating and trying to figure out the precise order of Mozart's works, according to when they were performed and when they were assumed to have been composed. And so with Mozart, we have these K numbers. The earliest K numbers date from when Mozart was like 5 years old, 4 or 5 years old, and they run up to his death at age 36. And they number well into the 600s, right? So a lot of music by Mozart in a relatively short life, unfortunately. Okay, let's listen to this. Oh, one other thing about this particular movement of this string quartet. It is very fast in tempo, and it is in a particular style which was becoming increasingly popular as we move through the 18th century and into the 19th century, and that is the gypsy style. And I guess gypsy isn't the correct word to use for them anymore. They're called Roma people now, but the gypsies are, of course, this population within Europe mostly, particularly Eastern Europe, of itinerant people. They are sort of migratory. They travel. They have these like caravans, wagons. I think today now they live in like campers, and they travel from one place to another and camp out. And they have their own distinct musical style, which was a favorite of not only just ordinary people. Very often, even if you're living in a big city, like you're living in Vienna during this time, you could go to a certain cafe and there would be a gypsy band there, or a band that specializes in playing in the gypsy style. And composers loved this style. It's sort of a very bipolar style. It can be sometimes very sort of morose and anguished and overwrought and emotional. And on the other hand, it can be sort of manic and very fast, very virtuosic, lots of notes. And this is something that really appealed to composers, this very dramatic kind of style. And Beethoven is deliberately imitating this style in the finale of his string quartet. So let's see if I can conjure it up here on the machine. So the first thing you're going to hear is the A theme. And this is a long rondo. So here we go. It's long, but it's fast, so it's going to go by pretty quickly. Notice this basic phrase repeats, so we become familiar with it. Okay, so that was the A section. Here's the B. And notice it has a different character. It doesn't have quite that same driving energy. It's more lyrical. Sort of like, again, the contrast between a first theme and a second theme in sonata form. Notice that in a string quartet, each of the instruments has a chance to shine. none of them are like strictly in the background. They each get a turn with the melody. It's more like a conversation among equals. That's why chamber players love the string quartet, maybe more than any other genre. Okay, so we're coming toward the end of the B section, and the A material comes back. Notice this time, there's a little intensification. It's not repeated exactly, but you can recognize it as being that A material. Now here comes the C section. And there's a motive here. It's just an upward flourish. And we'll hear it taken up by the different instruments. A material coming back. So that C section was fairly short, not really a development. And again, you might not recognize it, but there are some small tweaks in this version of the A. It's not exactly the same as the first A, but it's close enough that you can recognize it. Now we have a little bridge, a little transition. We're not really sure what's going to come next. It's the B material. This is Beethoven's way of telling us this is a long rondo. I'm bringing the B material back. Now he's bringing back like snippets of A. It's not a full-blown iteration of A. It's a bridge. We're being led somewhere. The tension is building. Here's our final A. Much faster all of a sudden. So this crazy gypsy style. And in addition to this, we have a coda. This is the coda. And it's a pretty long coda. And at the very end of the coda, do you remember the thing from the C section? This upward flourish of four notes. Beethoven brings that back from the middle of the piece, right? And you might not notice the first time you listen to it, unless you have me explaining it for you, like, oh yeah, that's that thing, that's that little upward motive from the middle, and Beethoven brings it back to end the piece. So sort of this ingenious, economy of materials. And referring back to the C section, which is the only section which doesn't get a repeat, right? In rondo form, C is the only one that doesn't get a chance to be heard again. So maybe that's why Beethoven chose it, just a little bit of it at the very, very end of the coda. By the way, that extended coda that we heard, this is a feature of Beethoven, especially as we move into the middle and late periods. It's one of several things that Beethoven does, which kind of, he's sort of taking the coda and doing the opposite of what a coda is expected to do. So remember, a coda is a concluding section. So I compared it to the conclusion in an essay, right? You write an essay and then you say, in conclusion, yada, yada, yada. I'm just going to restate some things briefly and tie it all up with a bow, and there you go, just so that you know I'm coming to the end. But increasingly with Beethoven, in the middle and later period, the coda is very long, and it's a chance to kind of like unpack and re-examine and maybe even redevelop material at a time when we should not be doing that, right? We need to bring this thing to a close, not unpack it again and take it apart again and build tension again, the kind of thing you would do in a development section. But this is exactly what Beethoven does. This isn't maybe necessarily a great example. I mean, this is a fairly long coda, but what we see in middle and later Beethoven is that the coda of whatever work it is, whether it's a first movement or a last movement or whatever, the coda can sometimes be, in effect, a second development section, like in a sonata form. We've got exposition, development, recapitulation, and then coda, but then the coda might turn out to be sort of developmental in character. And if you've developed and if you've built up the tension again, then you might need to have effectively another coda on the end of the piece in order to actually bring it to a close. And this is what we will see, for example, when we get to the first movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, toward the end of this unit. All right, so the next sections in the book, they talk about the classical symphony, which is an extended, ambitious composition typically lasting between 20 and 45 minutes, exploiting the expanded range of tone color and dynamics of the classical orchestra. They don't really mention in here where the symphony comes from, like, does it just get invented on January 1st, 1750? No. The word symphony, or symphonia, actually has a very ancient origin. It goes back to the Greeks, and it just basically means sounding together. It was, again, one of these generic terms for a work for an ensemble of instruments that were playing like in harmony. That's essentially, again, what symphonia means. Playing together in harmony, sounding together in harmony. Specifically, where the classical symphony comes from is from the practice of Italian opera composers, especially, to have an overture before an opera. The symphonia before the opera. Sometimes they use the word symphonia rather than overture, but it's the same thing. It's an instrumental work that comes before an opera. So as time went on, and I already talked about in the previous unit about how every opera has an overture, a piece of purely instrumental music played by the pit orchestra before the actual opera starts. It's like the opening credits music in a movie. Well, these symphonias or overtures tended to expand over time. They became sort of like more grand, and they had like a three-part form, three movements. A fast initial movement, a slow contrasting movement, and then a fast movement to round things off. And then the opera would start. Well, this form kind of broke off. It was like a spin-off from the opera, and the dance-like movement was added. And now you've got a four-movement work for an orchestra, which has sort of spun off from its origins in opera. So that's where the symphony comes from. And then they talk a little bit about the classical concerto. We've already talked, again, back in the Baroque era, about what a concerto is. But remember, there are two types of concerto in the Baroque. In the Baroque, there was the solo concerto for solo instrument plus orchestra. And then there was the concerto grosso for small group, including basso continuo and orchestra. The concerto grosso more or less goes away, is no longer fashionable as we move into the classical era, and it is the solo concerto, which is one of the favorite genres of composers in the classical era. But because the solo concerto is a work for a solo instrument and orchestra, this has an effect on its form. The form, we still see sonata form, and we still see rondo form, and we're still going to have some kind of contrasting slow section with some other form. But there are slight tweaks which are made necessary by the fact that it is not just a work for orchestra, it's for soloist and orchestra. So we will listen to some examples, and I'll point out what these slight differences are in the next lecture when we examine the concerto. See you then.